and welcome to the second volume of the Human Library. My name is Dina, and I am an archaeologist. And this evening, I'm going to tell you about a life in dirt, which is basically what my life has been for quite some time. Now, my full name is Dina Doroshenko, and I am a senior archaeologist at the Ontario Heritage Trust. Whoops, sorry. And I am working for an agency of the Government of Ontario through the Ministry of Heritage, Tourism, Sport and Culture Industries. And we are an agency which has been around for just over 50 years. We have a province-wide mandate to conserve, interpret, and protect and share Ontario's heritage. We act as a center of expertise and serve as the heritage trustee and steward for the people of Ontario through ownership of properties, including buildings, as well as looking after cultural artifacts and archaeological artifacts. We conserve provincially significant cultural and natural, tangible and intangible heritage. We interpret Ontario's history, and we celebrate its diversity and educate Ontarians of its importance in our society. Now, my office is located in downtown Toronto, but my work has taken me all over the province. And these next few slides just tell you a little bit about what our organization, its vision, its mission, and values are regarding protecting and promoting Ontario's heritage. And in many of these photographs, including this building, I have actually done archaeology. One of the things that I find is important about my life has been the fact that being born and raised in Midtown Toronto, a child of immigrant parents, my father was Russian, my mother Latvian, I spent my summers all over the province, and I got to explore a little bit as a child, and I loved being outdoors. And we didn't go to historic sites, but I became enamored with history in particular from being a young child, and through exploring parts of Northern Ontario. My father used to love going on long drives. And it's a good thing I got used to that, because my career has taken me on very long drives across Ontario, because Ontario is a very large province. And as a result, I also like to travel in terms of my personal life. I have been to Egypt. If you want to be an archaeologist, you should go to Egypt. And you should also go to Greece and Italy. And I've also traveled to Russia, Latvia, parts of Europe, South America. I've traveled all over England and Canada and the United States. Not surprisingly, when I travel, I often go to museums and historic sites, because now I'm kind of into that. And I also go shopping, which I can't help myself. But tip for everybody, if you're going to a museum site, go to the museum shop first, because it'll give you an idea of how much time you need to allocate at the end to go to the museum shop. I had an athletic sort of youth. I took figure skating, ballet, played the piano, didn't become a ballerina or a figure skater or a pianist, but I would say that, in many ways I had a well-rounded sort of childhood and teenagehood. I love reading. I've always read voraciously at times, and if you want to become an archaeologist, you do have to not only go to university, you also have to go and do postgraduate work, which might mean further education in the field that you're interested in. My interest in reading in my teens, and this is just sort of something interesting that happened, led me to applying for a part-time job in my local library. And I also worked full-time for 2 summers as a library page, and then part-time during the fall, winter, when I was in university at the main branch of the Toronto Public Library, down at Young and Bloor. But I also held other jobs when I was younger, and also had other interests in terms of possible careers. But it wasn't until I became interested in archaeology that, and actually that kind of happened in high school. I was in my first year of university, and it was my first day at my introduction to anthropology course, excuse me, in a large lecture hall. And I was sitting, further up, and a man walked up to the podium and started talking. And I realized as I was sitting there that he looked very familiar. And I thought, all right, where do I know him from? And it took me a good part of that hour to figure out where I knew him from. So at the end of that lecture, I decided that I was going to go down and say hello. I didn't think he would remember me, but you never know. So I went down and said, hi, I don't know if you remember me. And he looked at me and he said, Bickford? Bickford High School is in Toronto. And when I was in between grade 9 and 10, and then grade 10 and 11, I took non-credit summer courses because I was too young to work in, the first year, anthropology, and the second year, archaeology. And Larry was the instructor. It turns out he was a PhD candidate in physical anthropology. He was studying human evolution. And that kind of sort of made me think, that's great. This is something I'm going to enjoy. But it wasn't until second year that I determined that I really did like the archaeology courses I was taking. And I finally experienced digging on an archaeological site that fall on the weekends, volunteering. And that was pretty much it. It kind of made me decide to specialize in archaeology during my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's degree. And I took my field school in between my third and fourth year of university. And that meant 6 weeks in the field. My field school was on a historic site just south of Windsor, and also meant 6 weeks of camping. And even though I complained about how much my body hurt from all the physical labor, something which I still complain about, I loved every minute of it. It meant I was touching the past by removing the soil and seeing what was left behind, and also learning about who these people were. Now, while the majority of my career has been digging in Ontario, I did get to spend 6 weeks on an Iron Age Saxon site, and most of it was in a Saxon well, and that's me in the top left, recording the soil profile in that well, in England. I have to say, I do wish I'd done a bit more digging in other countries, but at least I got that opportunity. There are many things I like about the job I have at the Trust. Probably the most constant thing has been working outdoors. Now, having said that, it isn't always fantastic weather. And archaeologists do dig in the winter. I'm sorry to tell you that we do. And now that means sometimes we have to dig in extreme temperatures. I've dug in 40 Celsius weather, and I've dug in minus 40 Celsius weather in northwestern Ontario. But it also meant that I got to work in various parts of the province that if I'd had a different career, I probably never would have gotten to. And I've also met many great people along the way. And if I was in a different career, that would never have happened, and I would never have had those experiences. I also feel it's important to pay back to my profession. And that has included, during my career, to sit on boards of directors of various archaeological organizations, like societies, that exist not only in Canada, but the United States as well. And I've presented papers at professional conferences a great deal, and I've also published. Now, my job allows me to enjoy my passion for history and archaeology, and basically discovery. And that led to my realization some time ago that it's important to find a career where you love the work. Everything else that comes along with that is irrelevant. If you don't enjoy the work you do, don't do it. and find something that stimulates your mind, challenges you to learn every day, and keeps you engaged in the workplace. I think the best career decision I ever made was I was at the end of my 3-year residency in the PhD program at the University of Toronto. I already had a master's degree in archaeology, and I've been working on and off on contract jobs, but I decided to further my education, and I guess I was thinking maybe I'd go down the road of an academic career in archaeology, teaching at a university. But then this 1-year contract job came up, and I was really interested in it because it was just the type of work I wanted to do. So I applied, and I got the job. And that's probably the best decision I ever made, because that position got a 1-year extension, and the contract was renewed for a 3rd year. And it was in the 4th year that I was made permanent, and here I am today, telling you about the work that I do. But don't make the mistake of thinking that my job has not changed. It has changed a great deal over time. And that is also what keeps me engaged in this work. It is the fact that I get to travel, I get to do work on interesting archaeological sites across the province and meet a lot of people. Now, the challenges I face in my job are varied. You see, I work within the context of government, and that is very different than many other archaeologists who work in Ontario. I am a public servant and have government policies I need to be aware of, follow, and adhere to do my job. When I'm in the field, I am the authority, in essence, the manager of the project, and I make the decisions. And the reason for that is because the Ontario Heritage Act is responsible for regulating archaeology in the province. When I'm in the office, I report to a manager and also a director, and there are various protocols I have to follow for administrative purposes. And trust me, there's a great deal of administration. And it's not just related to archaeology, but it's because we're spending government funds at times. Now, if you're interested in knowing what qualifications I have to do my job, I am a licensed professional archaeologist. And archaeology, as I mentioned, is regulated in Ontario, and it's actually by the provincial government. It's by the Ministry of Heritage, Tourism, Sport, and Culture Industries. Now, what that means is that I have met these qualifications or requirements you see on the slide that they set for the type of license that I have. There are actually 3 types of licenses. The professional license is the highest level. The avocational is the lowest level. And in between is the applied research license, which is usually what we refer to as field directors, people who supervise field crews while you're on a dig. But as you can see, there are quite definite requirements, and it does mean you do have to think about furthering your education in the field of archaeology. But the most important experience is actually digging. Going through university and doing a 4-year BA in archaeology and never having dug does not make you an archaeologist. Find whatever opportunities you can to do archaeology. Now, to learn more about licensing in Ontario of archaeologists, if you go to the website that's down at the bottom of the slide, it'll tell you more about the qualifications and processes involved with working in archaeology in Ontario. Now, my duties are quite varied on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. I coordinate all the archaeological research we do. And sometimes that involves a great deal of logistical management. In fact, that sometimes I've thought logistics is my job. There is, for example, pre-excavation planning, which involves such things as the process of hiring people, putting the call out, arranging interviewing people, receiving letters of interest and resumes, going through those, arranging reference checks, deciding who to hire, offering them positions, and then, of course, contract management. Budget planning starts very early and involves organizing travel. And not only do I have to determine where we're digging, but for how long, and also how we're going to get there, because it's not just people I'm moving field equipment, all the tools that we need to do the dig. And of course, where we're going to stay, because since I work all over the province, and it's a big province, that means sometimes arranging travel, which often than not is by vehicle. And depending on where we are, we also have to figure out what and where, how we're going to eat. Now, excavation work, and this is an example of a site that I've returned to, I don't know, about like 8 or 9 times, maybe 10. And all those little squares you see are showing you all the excavation units that we have dug over time. And when I'm on site, I'm either there as the project director, which means I'm the lead. And that might be because I have hired a field director who's supervising on a daily basis, and I don't need to be there every single day. Or there are times when I'm both project and field director, and I'm on site every day. It depends largely on the budget and the significance of the site that we're at, and of course my time. And this is a sample of some of the major finds that we found on this historic site, which is in Eastern Ontario on the Ottawa River. And as you can see, we have buried foundations of buildings that are not visible in the landscape because they were torn down well over 100 years ago. This is another site which is in southwestern Ontario, in Windsor, and it's known as the Duff Babby House. Now, a lot of the work I do is called staged work. There are 4 stages of archaeological work that I can undertake under my license. Stage 1 archaeology is basically desk-based background research. You're determining the archaeological potential that might be on that property. It doesn't matter if it's a historic site or it's a tract of land. Based on assessing the potential for archaeological sites, and we go through a whole list of various checks we have to do, or checklist if you like. We take a look at whether the distance of water is close for drinking water, the topography, the soils. We also look at the archival records to see if there's any evidence of historic settlement periods that we might want to take a look at. If we determine there is potential, then stage 2 archaeology involves a test pitting strategy and or field walking, depending on the type of land or setting that you're in. Stage 3 is test unit excavation. So test pits are very small. They're usually only about 30 centimeters in diameter, and you dig until you hit basically natural soil. And that means it's subsoil. It's soil that has not been impacted by human beings. Test unit excavations are bigger. The standard is 1 meter by 1 meter. But as you can see in the photo on this slide on the lower left, we also dig in much larger units when we have to, on historic sites in particular. In stage 4, complete excavation of a site, what we often refer to as block excavation. In other words, we completely excavate the site. And this happens a lot in Ontario with Indigenous archaeological sites. Now, one of the main things about archaeology is that it is somewhat of a destructive science. And what that means is that if we don't record what we're doing thoroughly, we lose information. So archaeologists document everything. We do field notes, we do photographs, we draw soil profiles, and that's what you see on the right-hand side of this slide. And we also sometimes post-excavation do something else, which usually tends to scare people. This is the analysis of all the soils, what we call the depositional events. So each soil, level of soil has been assigned a number, and we've been able to put it into basically a temporal framework that helps us understand when things happen, when sort of and what the processes might have been. For example, it's a building that is constructed, and then it's an addition that is added. And we look at the way the soils are laid down, because it's all what we call man-made stratigraphy, and on historic sites anyways. And then we record that. And this provides us more understanding when it comes to analyzing the artifacts that we find in each of the soil levels. Because we want to know if what we're dealing is original deposits or soil that may have come from somewhere else and just been dumped on the site. Now, indigenous sites also have stratigraphy. It usually is much more shallow, but it's the same thing. We have to record the soils. We record the soil colors, the texture, even the color. And it's all part of the process of understanding how the site was created. And that's the job of an archaeologist. Now, post-excavation involves processing artifacts we have recovered from our digs. And that basically means washing, labeling, cataloging artifacts, and then analyzing the artifacts. Generally, I don't do that. I have contract staff who do the work, which I supervise. I am responsible under the Ontario Heritage Act for their work under my license. And I'm also responsible for a report that has to be written which I usually do, or sometimes if I have a field director, they assist me in part of the report production. And then I submit it to the ministry by the deadline that's given to me by the ministry as a condition of my license. I also manage the archaeological collections held by the Trust. Over the Trust's history of about 50 years or so, we've excavated over 1 million artifacts. And here you see just a sample of some of the indigenous artifacts that we have excavated across the province. Now, I'm currently working with a colleague on developing what we call an open public artifact catalog that will be on our website, hopefully by 2021, and allow people to search our cultural and our archaeological collections. I also develop policies and manuals and guides related to how we do archaeology at the Trust. I work within the Acquisitions and Conservation Services Unit of the Trust in the Heritage Programs and Operations Branch. These are artifacts that are from it's actually from one archaeological site that's of the historic period. And these are, most of them were found as fragments. And after the processing and analysis stage, we were able to have many mended, ceramic, and in the next slide, you'll see glass objects that reflect the lifestyles of this particular family in the early to late 1800s. And this family lived in Perth, Ontario, which is southwest of Ottawa. Oops, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Now, I collaborate with natural heritage coordinators. We have architects on staff and project managers on restoration and capital work on our historic properties. But I also work with our museum staff on other sites, our partners on projects that might require archaeology, and I provide advice and guidance, particularly in our conservation easement program. Now, easements are legal agreements which are held on title between the private landowner, or it could be a public landowner like the municipality, and the Ontario Heritage Trust, because we deem it to be of some provincial significance. And the clauses within this legal agreement allow us to protect what we feel are the heritage elements of that building, and sometimes it's of that landscape, and that sometimes covers the archaeology that might be buried below the surface. I also, as a result, have to review the alteration requests that come in from the owners about changes they want to make to the property. And if there's any digging involved, then we usually require them to do archaeology. That's not me necessarily who does it. The owners will hire archaeological consulting firms, and then I review the reports when they're done. I also work with natural heritage coordinators because we own about 160 properties across the province, tracts of land. And we also have a lot of Indigenous archaeological sites on many of those properties. Sometimes I go to these properties to do work, and sometimes I just do nothing more than what we call stage 2 testing, because we don't like to necessarily dig every site that we find. We like to preserve it or have some opportunity to preserve it for future generations. Now, my time is organized very similar to most people. I work 9 to 5 typically, but in the field that can vary because of the time of year. So sometimes it's a visibility issue. While I love digging in the fall, the days get shorter. In the summers, it can be very hot and humid, so we will start earlier and end earlier. I have a lot of contract staff I have to manage, so a lot of my time is structured when we're in the field, determining who's working where and what they're going to be doing. In a lab, I may also have contract staff. They're either cataloging artifacts, or they're analyzing artifacts, or they're helping me prepare an interpretive display, perhaps. And in the fall, winter, my time is usually spent writing license reports, depending on how many projects I've had that season. And then I have to make sure I follow the standards and guidelines the ministry sets for me as an archaeologist, as a licensed archaeologist. So I'm doing reports, I'm doing finished drawings, I'm organizing the photographs, I'm having artifacts cataloged, analyzed, photographed for my reports. And that sometimes can take months of work, simply because I may only dig sometimes for a few days, sometimes for several weeks. And the longest dig I ever did was for 6 months on the same site, Monday through Fridays. Now, as I said, when it comes to decision making, very often in the field, I am the decision maker. But in the office, I'm not necessarily the decision maker, because I report to a manager and director. And usually any decisions about we're going to start doing a project and anything that's financial related has to be approved and go through a delegation of authority. And that's something that is probably done in most other careers. I don't have, I can't do what I want. I do have to ensure that my superiors okay with what I am doing. Now, everybody sometimes is asked questions such as, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Well, my base of knowledge is probably my greatest strength. The years of practical experience, as well as the diversity of experiences, really have made me have helped me to develop expertise in the area, particularly the archaeology of historic sites. But I work with Indigenous sites as well. And giving my time and knowledge to coworkers, colleagues, people interested in coming into the industry is also something I'm really quite proud of as well. Weaknesses are harder. They're always harder. We never like to admit our failings. I guess I'm a little overcommitted to my work because I do find it hard to say no to projects. But I can also be a bit of a procrastinator. And I used to be that because there used to be no time limit set on when we submit archaeological reports from the ministry. But now they give us deadlines. And so I don't do that anymore. Now, if someone was interested in, let's say, my job, you have to be a team player because it's one of the important traits essential for working in archaeology. Most projects allow for individual digging, but very often it's the team as a whole who's responsible for completing an excavation. You end up working with people and sometimes living with them for long periods of time. And sometimes it feels like 24/7 and you can't get away from these people. But that requires you have to have the ability to get along with different types of personalities, because you are going to be working together and you might also be living in the same accommodation. Another ability is being able to take direction. And if you proceed up to a level as I have, the ability to give direction appropriately. And certainly, asking questions when you are tasked with certain responsibilities. So it's about being an active listener. It's not just about hearing. It's about understanding what's being communicated to you. Someone who has the ability to be a critical thinker can also be quite useful, because it's very important to be observant, detail-oriented, and to recognize when you might need help or advice. Now, the advice I give to people who want to become an archaeologist is that, one source of finding out more about Ontario archaeology is through the Ontario Archaeological Society and their website. People are sometimes surprised to learn how much archaeology is actually happening all around them. So it's not about digging in Egypt and Italy or Greece or some other country other than Canada. I mean, yes, there's plenty of people who do that, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people working as archaeologists across Canada and the United States. Education is very important. You will need, at minimum, a bachelor's degree. But in some cases, if you want to take my path, you need a minimum of a master's. And some people, depending on what they decide their career path will be in archaeology, they go for a PhD. So while in university, you have that time to discover if you're interested in digging and what those career opportunities are. For example, you really want to be an Egyptologist. Well, you live in Canada and you want to have a life in Canada. So how are you going to be able to afford that? A lot of people don't understand that the people who do dig in Egypt tend to be university professors or museum professionals. They all have PhDs. The crews that sometimes come with them from, say, Canada or whatever country they are based in are not necessarily paid staff. They may be graduate or undergraduate students who are getting experience, and they might be paid a stipend, and that's it. And projects are funded by grants. And as a result, they're finite and sometimes short-term. Now, in Ontario, the majority, I would say maybe 98% of archaeology, is done in the private sector by the cultural resource industry, cultural resource management industry. And there are private archaeological consulting firms, and there are also engineering consulting firms that have archaeology units and archaeology staff on board. And they do the majority of work, if you see an archaeological dig anywhere in the province. There are companies that have been in existence for over 30 years as archaeological consulting firms, and people spend their careers working in these firms. I even spent 2 years as a consulting associate for a firm earlier in my career. Now, what should you know about becoming an archaeologist? Well, as I may have mentioned, it is a very physically demanding job if you decide that you want to do nothing but digging. To know if this is your path, participate in a dig if you get the opportunity, if it arises in your community, for example. If you're of high school age, there is an excellent summer field school credit program that you can earn. It is through the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and it's called the Boyd Field School. I always tell people interested in going into archaeology, discover what you like about archaeology. Is it the field work, the digging? Is it working with artifacts? Is it specific artifact types? Is it the conservation of artifacts, the technical museum work that fascinates you? Is it the science related to archaeology? For example, soils, geology, because, for example, with Indigenous sites, we have sort of chipstone tool technologies people study. And you need to explore that through volunteer opportunities as you go through your educational path. Now, I don't often get the question, but it has sometimes come up as to what would I have done if I wasn't an archaeologist? And well, I thought about law and I thought about criminology because I did take courses. But the good thing about my job is that I've been able to do some of that because I deal with lawyers, illegal agreements, legislation. I even provide comments on legislation sometimes. And that has allowed me not only to do the work that I like, which is the field work and the artifacts, but also to incorporate some of that other interests, some of the other interests I had, growing up. Now, I suppose to finish off, because I think it's a random fun question, is what am I reading? Well, I just finished a Linda LaPlante mystery book. It's the 8th book in the Anna Travis series. And I recalled having seen the Prime Suspect television series with Helen Mirren. And I'd never read the books. So now that I've finished 8 books of Anna Travis, I've gone on to start to read the Jane Tennyson series. Because again, mysteries are like detective work, and detective work is like archaeology. So I hope you've enjoyed my presentation today.